To rise today to contribute to this third reading debate on Bill C-30, Budget Implementation Act 2021. I very much want to thank the bill's sponsor, Senator Monsione, for her very hard work in preparing and bringing this bill to the Senate. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Standing Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology, and especially our chair, Senator Petitclerc, for the time and effort they invested in studying a number of divisions in this legislation. My comments today are devoted to Division 34 of C-30, titled Early Learning and Childcare. In just 3 sentences, Division 34 sets out the first tranche of spending toward the government's ambitious plan to create a national child care system. But behind the short text of Division 34, colleagues, lies a long history of hopes, dashed expectations, and failed efforts to forge such a system. It was 50 years ago that the Royal Commission on the Status of Women called for accessible, affordable, high-quality national childcare. Its report, released in December of 1970, includes a remarkably modern-sounding call for childcare, and I quote from that report, quote, "We recommend that the federal government immediately take steps to enter into agreement with the provinces leading to the adoption of a National Daycare Act under which federal funds would be made available on a cost-sharing basis for the building and running of daycare centers meeting specified minimum standards." That was said in 1970. Over this half-century since the report, there were studies, and there were promises, and there were 2 major attempts to develop and pass federal legislation. The first of these was in 1987, when Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservative government came up with a $5.4 billion plan to create 200,000 new childcare spaces across Canada, among other items. That's a lot of money, $5.4 billion, especially in 1987. The legislation passed the House of Commons, but when Mr. Mulroney called an election in the fall of 1988, his child care initiative died on the order paper right here in the Senate, never to be resurrected after Mr. Mulroney's government won re-election. Nearly two decades later, in 2005, Paul Martin's minority Liberal government promised $5 billion over 5 years toward a national system. Mr. Martin succeeded in obtaining bilateral early learning and childcare deals with all 10 provinces just days before the 2006 election, but those arrangements were terminated by Stephen Harper's incoming Conservative government. So, 50 years have now gone by without such a national program. For much of this time, a national child care program was seen to be the next big social program to follow Medicare, which was our first big social program. But national child care was always on the back burner, always strangely out of reach, and always dominated behind other priorities. So I think it's really important for us to understand this journey and the historical moment we find ourselves in today. We are here to consider this national child care program developed by this federal government under Minister Freeland, with an estimated expenditure of $30 billion over 5 years. Yes, this is it. This is the real deal. The first step in this is an initial expenditure of as Senator Monsione said, $2.95 billion in fiscal year 21 to 22, and that is what is in C-30. This year's dollars will flow to provinces and territories in connection with bilateral agreements in respect of early learning and child care. The goal at the end of year one is to reduce the price of regulated childcare by 50% by the end of 2022 in all provinces and territories. Senators, I support the federal government's involvement in national childcare. Childcare is important from every possible perspective. For many decades now, women have recognized that independence and equality are advanced only when childcare responsibilities can be shared. Childcare makes it viable for women to work and to return to work, and it increases the quantity and quality of employment opportunities in childcare itself, and careers that are largely occupied by women, and it reduces barriers to women's success in the labor force. Government estimates suggest that this childcare plan could add 240,000 employment opportunities for women in Canada. And some experts, like the Vancouver-based Centre for Future Work, predict that as many as 780,000 more women are likely to join the labor force or increase their hours of work in the next 10 years as a result of affordable childcare. With women re-entering the workforce more readily, Canadians should also expect to see material increases to household income, especially among lower-income families, where a return to work was financially untenable with high childcare costs. My city, Toronto, consistently shows up as having the highest childcare costs in this country in almost every category of childcare, infant, toddler, and so on. So a 50% reduction in fees is going to be very, very helpful in my community. We know that health outcomes are linked to household incomes as well, and we know that children's outcomes are dramatically improved by access to early childhood education. The prospects for economic growth are also significant. Karen Hall, Director General, Strategic and Service Policy Branch, Employment and Social Development Canada, told the Social Affairs Committee that, and I quote, "For every dollar invested in early childhood education, the broader economy receives between $1.50 and $2.80 in return," end of quote. And at Social Affairs Committee, Craig Alexander, Chief Economist and Executive Advisor, Alexander Economic Views and Deloitte Canada, said, and I quote, "The economic multiplier, the return on investment that you get for childcare spending, has been studied a lot. The estimates range from around $1.50 for every dollar invested to upwards of $5, end of quote. So, a national childcare program will benefit women, children, families, and the economy. This is one of the very best ways for this country to build back better after the pandemic that has done so much damage to this country and to the world. As important as it is, I have two concerns about this initiative. The first is that the shape of childcare that is created by this spending depends entirely on what the federal government negotiates with the provinces. While federal objectives and principles around affordability, training, and quality have indeed been set out already in a 2017 framework document, the end result of this process is anything but clear. Professor Ken Bosanquist from McGill University, who came to speak to our committee, suggested that the child care plan was, as he called it, the opening bargaining position of the federal government. And he also stated, and I quote, "It is all aspiration, with the perspiration depending on negotiations with the provinces." The government holds up the Quebec system as a model, but there is no guarantee at all that most provinces, or even any provinces, will end up with this model. So that is one of my concerns. And my second concern is that I think this program is especially vulnerable to being cut as we go forward. This year's expenditure, just below $3 billion, amounts to a little less than 10% of the total and the very high price tag of $30 billion. That's a lot of money out there that's not currently allocated. Another government, other priorities, another emergency, concerns about fiscal prudence and concerns about the growing deficit, all of these or any of these may derail this program down the road. And then, colleagues, we have our history, which I summarized earlier. In 1988, a federal government created a national child care program, an election was called, and the program died. In 2005, a federal government created a child care program, an election was called, and the program died. In 2021, a federal government created a child care program, an election was called, and then what? Will history repeat itself, or will we take a different path? Colleagues, I am proud and pleased to be a parliamentarian today to cast my vote for a different and better future. Thank you. Merci.